All right, I'd like to call the House to order and call upon the Prime Minister now to open the debate on the motion this House opposes the American charter school movement. Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Thank you. Charter schools take money from our public schools. They arbitrarily stratify the education in the short term, and in the long term we think that charter schools will destroy our education system and ruin it for everyone by removing teachers' unions. Because of these reasons, this House would vehemently oppose the American charter school movement. What we think opposing the American charter school movement means is, if we're the government, perhaps banning charter schools outright. Less severely than that, we at very least want to restrict them more, give them more regulation, perhaps provide them less funding. We think this is pretty clear. We just don't like charter schools. So, getting into the reasons why this is the case. First off, we think that charter schools massively harm those who simply don't get in. So these are based on a lottery system. It's entirely arbitrary who actually gets into the system. For those who don't, we think that this system creates a worse environment for them. Charter schools take public money and provide it to these private institutions for these charter schools. However, this harms the people who are still left in the public environment. Why is this? Because the public school takes money because the charter school takes money from the public institution. Sure. We have fewer resources available in the public institution. Now, you're also taking students out of the private institution. However, by splitting the money into two different institutions, you actually create massive inefficiency, especially for the original public school. So why is this? When you take money away from it, you remove a lot of the ability for these schools to do things that require startup costs. A lot of the costs involved in running a school are simply flat costs to buy computers, buy buildings, and actually run your school, right? Actually paying teachers, paying salary, we think this is a much smaller cost compared to owning the building, having all of the resources that you need to teach. So because of this, when you remove some of these money, because it's a flat value that you have to pay up front, you aren't able to get as good of these resources or as strong of these base costs that you need to actually run a school. So the result of this is that your public schools will decline in value, not just that they're able to serve fewer students because they're serving fewer students, but they're actually not going to be able to provide as good of an education.
Do the best cities in America have gigantic public schools, or rather diversified small public schools?
So, they have diversified. So I'm sorry. Oh, so they're going to have smaller public schools, I think, on balance. Yeah, I think that's true. However, the majority of the costs are still going to maintaining the buildings, right? That's the difference. So you're still going to maintain these buildings, you're still going to maintain facilities. That's still the main cost that's associated, even if you have smaller institutions. That's still true. So regardless, by taking money away from public schools and giving them to charter schools, you're removing the base cost that you have to run these institutions, and you're going to make the quality of education in the public schools better. So because you're making this inefficient and you're harming those who don't get into public schools, we think that you're fundamentally harming those who don't get in. And this is a lottery system, and so this leads me to my second point, which is that it's fundamentally unfairly lotteries students into a better or worse system. Now, we think that in the short term, these charter schools are going to offer a better education. They're smaller, you can have more teachers and more, you're going to have more student-teacher interactions because they're smaller, and this is a good thing, right? However, we think that this is unfair because you're fundamentally giving a right to education and making it arbitrary. You're literally assigning it a lottery value. We think that other forms of inequality exist in the US, but we're not debating those today, right? We're talking about adding in or allowing this other element of arbitrariness that we don't think is fair and don't think makes any sense. So we think that education is a fundamental right. I'll take you in a minute after this point. We think that education is a fundamental right, and by stratifying it arbitrarily, you're fundamentally disadvantaging those who remain in the public school and who don't get into this charter school. Go ahead.
What would be the problem with expanding charter schools to the point where there are enough seats for everybody, and then they're no longer meeting the lottery?
So this is going to get into my third point, but let me finish this one up first. So because we're making this right arbitrary, we don't think that this is actually maintaining education as a fundamental right for everyone. If you extended this principle and said we're going to arbitrarily give some people education and give others none, we would say that that's fundamentally unfair and it's an arbitrary value. By the same principle, we think that when you arbitrarily give some students a better education, again, in the short term, you're doing a disservice to those who don't get it. So now this leads me to my third point, and this is an answer to his POI. If everyone is in a charter school, what would be bad about that? So we think that charter schools are fundamentally a threat to teachers' unions and to our quality of education on the whole. So, why does this happen? Charter schools are allowed to hire non-unionized teachers. Now, the problem with this is that non-unionized teachers often don't require, or you aren't required to give them the same kind of benefits, the same tenure tracks, the same salary, the same health benefits, or other benefits that often come with the job, especially the job stability that you're required if the teacher is in a union. Now, public schools have to hire from a union, and the result of this is that often these teachers are getting these benefits. They're getting tenure, they're getting long-term job stability, which is one of the main reasons that people go into teacher positions. For the most part, teaching is not a well-paid profession, but people go into it either because they love it, but also, importantly, because of the benefits that you often receive as a teacher, and that's because of these unions. When you're guaranteed job stability, when you're guaranteed a stable position for a long time, like you can get often because of these teachers' unions, you're more likely and you're incentivized to go into this job. Now, when charter schools are allowed to hire non-unionized teachers, they subvert this. So people who are going into the charter business often don't get these benefits. They don't get the long-term job stability. They don't get these other perks that you currently get by being a teacher because you're in a union. So the problem with this, as back op is so proudly proposing, they want to expand charter schools to the point where everyone's in it. In the long term, we think that this is effectively going to remove teachers' unions. So what does this mean? You're going to have fewer people who actually want to go in and become a teacher. You're going to have less qualified people becoming teachers, and you're fundamentally going to degrade the quality of our education, not just for charter schools, but also for public schools. Now, the more charter schools you have, the bigger this becomes a problem, because the fewer teachers that end up actually unionized, the more that are working outside of the union, the lower these salaries can be. And the fewer benefits that these teachers can receive. So this, we think, is a fundamental problem with charter schools, and we think that by advocating them and by allowing them to continue, you're fundamentally degrading the quality of our overall education system by lowering the quality of the teachers we receive. This, we think, is one of the biggest problems of charter schools, and this is what they're going to get on their side of the house by promoting them. For all these reasons, we are proud to
The Prime Minister will allow the report to lead the opposition to establish the opposition's position.
Mr. Speaker, it's important to place this motion in the context of the last 50 years of American history. What have we seen throughout the vast majority of poor school districts in the United States over the last 50 years of the history? We've seen white flight. We've seen massive increases in urban poverty and an increase in the class divide. And we've seen a school system that's failing due to two central factors: the political domination of anti-government conservatives and the economic imperatives that are imposed by the fact that local governments are funding these institutions. What does that mean? That means that charter schools are a necessary component of actually fixing this problem, because we tell you, and we stand on the principle agreed to by SciGov, that there is a right to education. But we tell you, in the absence of adequate provision of that right, adequate fulfillment of that right, there must be private individuals who can step in to facilitate with the government that right, because some individuals actually getting access to a right is always preferable to no individuals getting adequate access to that right. And what did we say? In the current public school system, there are none. But here's the second reason why that principle is incredibly important, because there are some people who are getting adequate provision of education, and they're the rich in private schools. Insofar as we can have some individuals through a lottery system that are not of means at least have some chance of getting a better education, these individuals can rise up, can actually have better education, and grow communities and reduce poverty in the long run by breaking that cycle of poverty. So we're going to talk about how in the short term this fulfills the right now and why these charter schools are incredibly important. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about why the long run proponent of charter schools ensures adequate provision of the right. But first I want to do 3 bits of rebuttal. So the first thing that they tell us is that these charter schools harm those that don't get in. And I think that I've already sort of hit this and talked about the principle. Everyone is hurt in the status quo. What they don't want to talk about is what's been going on has been tried over and over and over again for the last 40 years with no success. We say the structural impediments that come economically, politically, and from those teacher unions, which I'm going to talk about in a second, will ensure that forever, with no change, we will see no success. Insofar as charter schools are putting competitive pressure on those public schools, we see there's reasons why those schools actually need to improve, because otherwise more resources will shift towards charter schools, which threatens the existence of those positions in administrators and threatens those jobs of those teachers. We think that will make them better. No. So next they talk about how this is inefficient. This is really silly. Like, one big school is not always the solution, right? There are startup costs that are incurred one time and they're like manageable, but there's also like problems with overtly large schools, right? Like classrooms that get too large and a chaotic climate that can happen when these schools get too big. I think when they respond to our POI by conceding that smaller, diversified schools can often do much better, they basically concede our analysis at this point. But finally, the notion about expanding charter schools and why that would be bad, because of the importance that job stability provides through teachers' unions in attracting individuals to the profession. We say this is just simply not paying attention to the empirics. Like Teach for America has demonstrably shown there's an enormous appetite by those of an incredible intellectual backgrounds and incredible means to go into the teaching profession. Why don't they stay? Why do not as many people join the teaching profession? We tell you 4 reasons. One, these schools are terrible. On our side of the house, we have schools that are less terrible and thus they're more likely to stay. Second, we tell you that they're forced to teach poorly because of strictures in curriculum and less innovation that fundamentally hampers their ability to feel like they're doing a meaningful job. Thirdly, we tell you that these new teachers see bad teachers ensconced, have leadership positions over them, and actually dictating the terms on which they can teach, which is incredibly problematic and forces them out. And finally, low pay, which actually directly clashes, I think, with this job stability point. Because without job stability, we can fire the shitty teachers. But the notion that we can actually solve low pay too is important. Why? Because higher pay is impossible when local governments have to provide the resources because they quite simply don't have them. They're funded primarily by property taxation in areas full of urban blight. But on our side of the house, we get public partnerships, public-private partnerships. Not only do those bring private resources in, but when you combine them with things that I'll take you in a moment, like social impact bonds that we've been seeing in the United Kingdom, where these firms can actually benefit through social benefit by getting a higher payout when these schools, for instance, reduce recidivism rates or get higher college graduation rates, we can get more private investment in. Yes?
Okay, so when these charter schools attract the best teachers by paying them more, what happens to the kids in the public schools who have the worst teachers because they have lower ability to pay them?
We see public pressure to expand the charter school system, which is exactly what we want. Our 2 pieces of substances. First, while we provide the right adequately now. We told you each individual has the right to achieve a level of training and knowledge to make fully autonomous decisions, participate as a citizen, and pursue their own conception of the good. Thus, the state has an obligation to provide education in a meaningful respect so that these people can access those 3 tiers. So, why is the state failing in the status quo? 1, dropout rates are nearly like 50% in large swaths of the United States. Individuals are not even completing their education. So the notion that education, even if you stuck through all the way, would be adequate is belied by the fact that these people are not staying through. Secondly, lower levels of adequate provision of reading skills and mathematical skills are rife throughout these areas. We see people who can't even pass like 5th grade reading tests, often coming out of high school, Mr. Speaker. That's incredibly important because these individuals are not prepared to actually enter their life in a meaningful sense, pursue jobs, and actually end up in the cycle of incarceration, which is the third thing. That even if these schools were okay, the fact that the vast majority of these individuals are often moving from juvie to school, have gang affiliations, and have massive structural social problems within the presence of these schools, means that you need to break those social structures up. A good way to do that is small, focused charter schools that can radically impose certain kinds of curriculum and modify the circumstances in which these kids live. So, charter schools fulfill this obviously. Like, they basically concede this, but just go over it quickly. We get massive innovation in curriculum, we get the hiring and firing of teachers, so we not only recruit better teachers and can give them terms that they might be incentivized to do, which doesn't always have to be higher pay. Like a lot of these TFA, like the 3 reasons I gave you that were non-monetary, I think are actually quite important. And also we can fire the old bad teachers, which is crucially important because otherwise they're ensconced forever. And lastly, we provide more resources. As I talked about in rebuttal, we can get a crucial infusion, which is necessary because these local governments don't have the funds. But secondly, let's talk about the long-term pressure, because I don't think SciGov provided much of one. Here's the political dynamic in the United States. There's one political party that is absolutely bound to the public school system. The Democrats, since the Great Society, have been investing in education, have been promoting education, have been adding resources to it. But we have one political party, we tell you, that has no real vested interest within education. We tell you they're so radical at this point that you often see individuals like Ted Cruz coming up and calling for the abolition of public schools altogether, a complete move to an all-private system. That's like absolutely ridiculous and would be devastating. So what do? We align both sides of the political spectrum, Mr. Speaker, to actually advocate for better education. Why is this crucial? Because the Democrats already are, but Republicans love charter schools because they increase autonomy, allow for innovation, involve the private sector, all the sorts of things that conservatives generally like, which means that whichever side wins a particular election, we tell you, Mr. Speaker, they're both trying to improve education. Instead of one being a radical anti-education whatsoever, anti-anything other than private education, we get the Republicans coming into government and actually trying to improve these charter schools, which even if you think that they're not as great, they are getting that investment from Democrats. We now get some investment from Republicans, and we are very, very proud to oppose.
Having excluded the opposition for establishing the opposition position, we'll now return our attention to the proposition. Here's the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you. I think there's a fundamental misconception of the way that charter schools will operate in the long term on-site opposition. Because they get this argument that they'll have this private investment, and that will be great because now these countries will be invested and want to make profit from the school. It'll make so the schools have better operating budget and can provide better service to the students. But what does a for-profit system actually look like? We think that when they have a system that depends on private investment trying to retain future capital, that fundamentally makes the schools trying to best maximize their profit margin. So what do we think the impacts of this are? This means that it will sacrifice academic quality for economic efficiency. Things like not funding arts programs, things like not funding new types of innovative programs like computer labs. We think that oftentimes the pro-charter school movement tries to claim innovation, but we don't think it's innovation to better academic quality. We think it's innovation to better economic efficiency. We think it's going to fundamentally, in the long term, decrease the quality of these schools in favor of economic efficiency. And maybe they're going to argue, because they bring up this point that like when their test scores will be better, they'll get better contracts. That's the type of competition that exists. But no, what I think actual competition means is that when the schools can say, hey, we're not spending we're being more economically efficient. Not now. When we'll be more economically efficient, you should make more charter schools. We think that it's only economic efficiency which creates the political will to create more charter schools. That means that their charter schools will be successful in spreading merely because of their economic efficiency. Not right now. I go out to get them. Then we get this. So I think there's a second layer of the problem of privatization, because we think that when you have this privatization, it lets the interest to dictate education in a way which the people not in the government should not be able to do. We think that things like school boards, or state boards, or governors, those are the people who are trusted in the public good to decide what students ought to teach. Just keep in mind that what students ought to teach is a very political idea. When you have private institutions determine whether you should have abstinence education or not, determine how you should teach the Civil War, whether it's the War of Northern Aggression, or the Civil War, and all these things. When you allow people who are private interests, I'll take you after this point, to dictate what we teach, it puts this idea, and sure, there may be disagreements on what we should teach, but we think those disagreements should happen in the public sphere, not the private one. Yeah.
Why should politicians be picking curriculum instead of allowing teachers to pick from a variety of different curriculums through a charter school system?
So we don't think this is going to increase teacher choice of curriculum. We think that teachers are going to be, if anything, more at the mercy of the private school because they don't have the freedom to say and do what they want to do because they don't have long-term job stability. We think this is going to increase those who are in charge of the private schools' ability to dictate the curriculum, which is far worse than politicians, but who are actually generally school board members who are explicitly elected to do just this. Maybe he says that any choice is biased, but we're going to have a choice to be the one that is publicly accountable. So now let's talk about these arguments they give us about how this is going to be best for the charter schools because, well, actually teachers are going, because it's going to improve the lives of those who don't have good education, and that it's better to give some people good education than no people good education. Here's the problem. We don't think this is like a binary of like, do you have education right now or do you not? That's not the situation that's happening. I think right now there's a certain level of education. Yes, it could be improved substantially, but we think this is only going to decrease the quality for the vast majority of the population. So we think it does outweigh on our side because most people are getting worse teachers. Most people are getting less funding for the schools per capita, versus on their side, only a small minority who are arbitrarily chosen get the better view. But also there's a second level analysis here, which I think they presume that some people having a better system is better than no one. Here's the problem. When only some people have this better system, first of all, it's arbitrary, which we say fundamentally violates your right to a quality education system, which is guaranteed by the government. But second of all, maybe this allows for a facade of solvency, that people will think, oh, I can go into a few urban neighborhoods with a few like minority students who did successfully. That means that our system is fine. We think that when you allow people to pick up individuals and claim them as success stories, but you ignore the vast majority of the population, that means that there will be less attention paid to the other school system. Sure.
Why are you comfortable with the only children getting an adequate education being the children of the rich?
I'm not comfortable with that situation. I think that's kind of shitty, but I don't think you should add further inequality to the system as a restitution for the fact that some inequality already exists. I don't see how that's particularly relevant. Yes, there are problems. Let's not make more of them. So now we get to the argument they make about how which I think doesn't make a lot of sense, about how the charter schools are going to allow for a better education system because they are smaller. And we agree. And smaller school systems would be better if everyone could be in a small school system, but we already showed this direct trade-off. Like, he makes this argument against our arguments about the economics of schools, that, well, the fact that startup costs are a big deal doesn't matter, because the best school systems do have lots of different small schools. Mr. Speaker, if this was a debate about whether we should have a school system where lots of people are in small schools, or a school system where everyone is in one big large school, that would be a very different debate. This is a debate about whether we should have a few people go through this lottery system into a small school and everyone else be in this much larger school. Keep in mind in this like utopia where everyone has charter schools on their side of the house, we don't think they will keep the small class sizes we have today. Even those class sizes today exist because there are so few charter schools. If everyone was in charter schools, then the government would be diverting lots of these resources in these schools to try to be economically effective, would condense all of those students into larger schools, because as we showed, that's more economically efficient. We think that when you have a larger school, that is more economically efficient, and where on our side, the best public school systems will still, despite that inefficiency, split people up into smarter schools. On their side, the only motivating factor is economic efficiency. You're going to sacrifice that pure that focus. No, thank you. So now let's talk about something which there's a lot of clash on, which is about teachers' unions and how this will affect the teacher system. So I think they make this ludicrous argument that teachers will be better off and more likely to join teaching if teachers' unions don't exist. So they use this fantastic example of Teach for America, which is a terrible program which causes people to go into teaching for a few years and then leave, leaving these students with teachers who they don't have any connections to and aren't very experienced. Here are the problems in a world without teachers' unions. No one will want to go into teaching the long term. Keep in mind that teachers are incredibly well-educated people in academic fields, paid an average of $45,000 a year in this country, drastically lower than they can make in the private sector. No matter how much they raise the salaries on their side of the house, they're not going to outweigh the fact that they can make a better salary somewhere else. So why do people join teaching? Some of it, of course, is doing what's best for the kids. We think the other aspect is that they can have a system of economic stability. When you think you take away that system stability, so take away their system to even collectively bargain for higher salaries. Like they say they'll have higher salaries in their side of the house, but why should they? If they have no collective bargaining ability, they won't get the higher salaries. We think when you don't think there's this intrinsic desire to get better teachers when you're a for-profit school. We think the problem with the system that it sacrifices the quality of teachers will be less educated, less qualified people wanting to go into the teaching field, which hurts in the long term not only the public sector but also the charter school, because none of the teachers will be effective as they are before. They just say that teachers will want to do things because they want to work in these better schools. We think, in fact, teachers are often motivated to try to help people who are struggling academically. But more importantly, we think all of the schools will be worse off on our side of the house in a system where teachers don't exist. They say that you should be able to fire bad teachers. We think, especially in a private sector, petty ideas about when disagreements between bosses and employers will determine what constitutes a bad teacher. We don't think there's an objective way of determining that. I think they just completely lower the way of how we evaluate teachers. I think for very clear reasons, we should evaluate teachers.
Thanks, Prime Minister. I would remind everyone that this is a small room. You're sitting closer to me than the speaker is, so please keep the comments between your party around. You don't know you need to discuss, but keep it to a little rumble if you could. We'll open the floor now to the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the arguments against the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What Brown brought you in opening opposition was two important contributions in this debate. Firstly, as a principle, how private actors facilitating the right to education is important in the context of state failure to provide public education. But also secondly, we decided to play the long game, talking about how charter schools are a necessary component to the solution of the education problem that we have in the United States of America, and that's what they're missing in today's debate. Because the comparative is this. There is public schools in which arbitrariness exists all over the place, in which you fail entire school districts because they don't have funding, and even in public schools that work great, the people with rich parents also have that arbitrariness benefiting their side. But also secondly, that local governments don't adequately fund this kind of thing, and therefore there are structural problems that require structural solutions, which is exactly the proliferation of charter schools on our side of the house. I'm going to issue two questions in rebuttal and move on to the third substantive our side of the house, which is how this betters education in the long run by tapping into a resource pool that hasn't been tapped into. So first question is very simple. How do we best address the problem that exists in American education? Because both teams recognize public schools suck, right? They say that, well, it sucks, but it drains resources from the public schools. But that's still acknowledging the problem. The question then becomes, at that point, how do we solve that problem? Alex brought you many important problems and characteristics of public schools. First, he talked about class divide, and second, he talked about bureaucratic inefficiency. On the point of class divide, they say that, well, you're actually making the solution of the problem worse because you're adding an element of arbitrariness to that. Well, the question is, there exists already an element of arbitrariness. We say that we prefer a lottery system more to the birth lottery, in which people with with very strong economics get better education on their side of the house. No, thank you. Also, you're not failing someone who goes to public schools, because on our side of the house we propose proliferation of charter schools, in which innovative methods ensure you a better facilitation of the right of education, and that's an important principal concession coming from that side of the House. They talk about bureaucratic inefficiency, but to that we say, what is the best way to solve bureaucratic inefficiency that has been quagmired by the political divide between Conservative Party and Democratic Party? It is responding to the people's interests, and that can only happen at the context in which charter schools are deciding to take innovative methods that actually benefit people because they are closely communicated to their audience. That's an important characteristic that they don't respond to. So, at the end of this day, under this point of refutation, we say that the problems are in fact structural, and that's why we need to act a structural solution of charter schools into this case. Why? This is where Alex's argument about the right to education comes important. Because education is a very important thing for the state to consider. And if the state can't provide adequate education, it should do so. Why? Because education is a facilitative right. If you have education about the political system, you have a better idea of how the political system works and how to play the game of politics to benefit your side of the house or your side of position in politics. But also, secondly, we say that having this kind of pool is very important. We saw the problem that we identified, and that's the contribution on our side of the house. The second question, no thank you, is talking about charter school as a movement. Because note that they talk about public schools are bad and charter schools are bad, but the motion dictates that this has to have some kind of directional force, in which we're talking about a specific proliferation of private schools. We say that there are two important things that we need to know about this movement. First is the idea of education responding to public demand, in which charter schools can respond to their audience, can respond to their clientele, because they're unlike local governments in which they do have the resources and they have the interest to actually gain a lot of students to get all the public funding and the private funding that Alex talks about. But also secondly, recognize that education currently at this status quo is very politicized, in which conservative parties don't like to fund education at the expense of, for example, having stronger defense budgets or other important things that are important to their political goals. We say that this actually frees that from their, this actually helps the political fight because the two interests converge. The Democratic Party is willing to provide you the resources to have better schools because they're interested in the idea of having education and having rights fulfilled for all sides of the house. But also, conservative parties actually, the Conservative Party also wants to cherish the idea that you have a right to to build a system of education or a program of education that is fitting to you, in which some kind of conservative regions can talk about, for example, religious schools, or talk about, for example, education that is important to their side of the house. What we say is that, why is this important? Because education, if anything, is a long-term game, right? We have to talk about how, even if talk about how this direction leads to more resources for the education system to tap into because it has the support of the political conservative party, and that importantly creates better education. It creates the stability of support so that you don't have to, so for example, the school system and the school funding doesn't have to weather around whether the Democratic Party is in charge of power or whether the Conservative Party is in charge of power. But also, even if you like the idea of having some kind of public schools, it is important to note that on our side of the house, with the proliferation, you have a choice of education. If you don't like the public school, then you can simply go again and actually cherish the idea of public demand, because there is a school that responds to your incentive, and that's what we brought to you in this kind of house. What's up?
Yeah. The goal of your world is to be a world where all schools are charter schools. In that world, what is the check on charter schools for doing things that are economically effective, but not academically effective?
First, we say that the idea of being economically effective is just a fancy way. Because what we say is that the idea of being economically effective is that you respond to what people want, and what people want is good education. Because they have the interest to actually learn, and they have the interest to tap into the political system, and we think that's very important. Third to stand is better education. I think there are 2 points to capture. First is tapping a pool of resources that hasn't been touched. They say that, well, if you have public schools, then you drain resources from public schools. That's not true, because it's not a zero-sum game, right? Because we say that people who fund charter schools are not the local government in which they fund the public schools, right? Also, they talked about this idea of how we have for-profit institutions, and that's bad. Firstly, we say, Alex clearly mentioned it's private funds. He talked about social impact funds in the United Kingdom, in which it's not just for-profit. But even if we bite the burden that it is for-profit, what's so bad about that? The very idea of about education responding to its clientele is a good thing on our side of the house, because these people have the interest. We also say that innovation can happen because it leads to a necessary spillover effect. If there's a good program going on in charter schools, that spills over to public schools because they have the interest to actually educate their citizens better. We say all of this is very important, and also the idea of being interested in education by having a more educated community actually tap into this idea. Secondly, talk about the idea of political direction, why this leads support for better education. Because education, to some extent, is going to be about economic resources. It is going to be about the idea of TFA being paid well. And they say that TFA is very bad and like all this stuff, but they don't realize why do TFA, all these innovative teachers, leave Teach for America. It is because they're treated shitty in public schools. And the very idea of having an alternative that these people can go to is a good benefit that we provide on our side of the house. And that's very important because we actually converge the political interest, because we provide better education, and because we provide education that actually responds to your interests. We think that we're winning this debate.
My thanks to the Deputy Leader Rock for closing the first half of the debate. To open the second now, we'll turn our attention to the member of the government.
Here, here.
So on opposition, we see a dismal scene created for basically the public and private, like completely private and public schools, right? We have a dismal scene of like basically the way the public system works now is wrong, and we also get from their side of the house that the way an all private school would work is also wrong, right? So we have this, they give you like the charter school as a solution, but let's explain like why it provides no benefits that public schools provide, and also has all the negative harms that a completely private system has. So we're going to show you that the reason why charter school has emerged as this third option is because it gets funding from the government, but it's still completely run by private individuals, right? So the funding, like in status quo, the way the funding works, it gets money from the government. So you're siphoning money from the public school system that currently exists, but it's still completely run by private individuals. So government has no regulation. So it doesn't oversee any of the curriculum, etc. But let's explain like why public schools, like the very foundation, has an intrinsic value and benefit that private operations don't work. We show you that basically that public schools have this idea of citizenship, and it teaches future citizens how to engage in democracy, how to be good citizens. Like we talk about like a lot of the pragmatic arguments, but fundamentally it gives students like tools that they need to be better members in society, and that includes classes like government classes, right? Like history classes. These things we show you that there's no incentive to create a private school system. Like in a charter school, they don't need to teach government, they don't need to teach history. It's not pragmatic in the future, right? But we show you that public schools think that this is necessarily a good thing because it better prepares students to go on in society and be good citizens, which you think is a very intrinsic value that has gone unnoticed in the entire debate, which we offer as very positive. But next up, no thank you. But let's also talk about this idea of equality. Like, public schools is created as a way for all citizens, right? All citizens to have this equal access to their education. But we show you that charter schools will not provide any of this. They say, look, we can just proliferate charter schools. Like, first of all, you can't ever do that because in that process of doing that, you're going to completely erode the public system completely, right? But we also show you that the way the status quo works, we see only a few select charter schools because there is no funding, and if you get more funding, you're really damaging public schools. But next, let's talk about how this really reduces equality just overall. So we show you that the school, where you put a charter school, is not in these areas where they most need it, right? Not in areas with low socioeconomic backgrounds, not in areas where children really need this education. They're going to be put in places where it makes sense for them to put it, where they're going to get more middle-class citizens to attend this school. And we show you that that's very negative for two things. So the people that really need this education, right? The people that they claim are dropping out, the people that they claim have no access to anything, and it's creating this cycle of poverty. Charter school doesn't help that. It makes it worse. We show you that when charter schools are created, we actually take money from the public, right? We take public funding, so these students who are still stuck in those schools have a worse education in the long run because governments can't provide more money more money for these public schools. But second, we show you this facade. We need to talk about how charter schools doesn't incentivize change. So we see a very negative. Yes.
So obviously there are limited resources. What is a better way to spend those resources? Being putting money into politicized and very bad public schools, or giving that money to charter schools in which innovation can happen and good things can actually happen.
Let's explain why that's not going to happen, right? So you're going to give this money that you need to create new charter schools will take away, will give students 100 students this opportunity, but those aren't the students that need it. Those 100 students, those individuals from poor backgrounds don't have the access to drive to charter schools. Their parents don't have the money to provide these students with the ability to drive in every single day if it is far away or even if it's close. The students who really need it are not going to actually get any benefits that you claim. Only middle class individuals and people in the higher up brackets of society will get this change. But second, we show you that when charter schools exist, they act as a facade, right? So the government needs to fix public schools. We all agree with that. But when you create one charter school in one state, you're saying, oh my God, the problem's fixed. Oh wait, but they said the 99% of the other schools are not fixed, right? Those 99% of public schools are still broken. And in fact, they're actually getting worse because when you give all this money to one school and you leave 99% of the population completely stranded, they have less money to fix the situation, and there's no incentive for incentive from society to actually change and improve these public schools. Like, we don't see that because this is creating like a false fix. Like, that's not actually creating, like, fixing the root of the problem, which is bad public schools. It's just creating one tiny solution, right, that only helps 100 people, leaving 999,000 people completely stranded without any education and without any way to get rid of these cycles of poverty, these cycles of low socioeconomic backgrounds that they see so bad. Yes?
Ma'am, so when we talk about a movement, we're trying to increase the number of these schools. So why is that analysis relevant when you say that there are only going to be a few schools?
Okay, so like you take out this movement, right? Those schools still exist. Those public schools that still exist. So in this movement, there's still going to be a huge area of time when you're changing all money from public schools to these charter schools. Like in that moment, what do those kids do that don't have access to charter schools? Are they going to be in schools that are completely like left alone, who have no money at all? Like, it's not like a day thing. It's not like, oh, you know what? We're going to create lots of charter schools, and it's going to take like one day. No, it's going to take several decades, and in those decades, all those students who are in those public schools have no funding, right? All those students in those public schools are left stranded because, like, oh, don't worry, we'll get to you like later, right? When we have enough resources, we'll get to you later. Like, it's not a quick fix as you claim. Yes.
Which is it? Are there no benefits because these charter schools will only exist in rich suburbs, or are they actually going to exist in these urban poor districts where you claim they'll be a drag on resources? Which is it?
No, I'm saying that one in the status quo, we don't see like these charter schools actually in poor districts, right? We don't see that happening. They're actually going to be in rich suburbs. But like your whole argument is that we're going to proliferate. Like that, I was just responding to the proliferation argument, which is not feasible. You don't have the money to do that, and especially in a quick fix. And even if you have like money, maybe in the future, it's still going to take too much time, and in that time, kids are going to get disadvantaged. But it's like discuss the idea that they brought to you about like how like private schools are supposed like these charter schools like help these students like increasing the quality of education. We see that that doesn't make sense. Like we show you that when people are like forced we see that doesn't exist. So like when these companies are if they are actually partnering, which we don't even think they will, when they're partnering with these governments to create like these schools, if they are going at the end of the day for the profit value, like for the profit margin, they're not going to actually want what's best for the student. They're going to want what's best for them. That's the whole point of why a private institution, why you claim like an all private school system, I quote, is very bad and we shouldn't want that. Well, hello, it's the same system. You're siphoning money from the government, but it's still a private institution. All the reasons why they're so uncomfortable with an all privatized school like that Senator Ted Cruz wants is because of this like complete independent autonomy from these private individuals, right? So we still get that in the charter school movement, but we're also siphoning money from the government, so it doesn't even help people who are in public schools. And it's for these reasons I am proud to propose. Thank you.
Our thanks to the proposition's member speaking. I'll turn it over to the member of the opposition to make the arguments against.
Here.
On second opposition, we are supporting this system in which teachers will have the preferences in order to teach students in the ways that they feel are best and the ways that they feel most comfortable to do. And that is going to be the first extension point that I'm going to highlight. And I'm also going to highlight why curriculum development and implementation of resources are done much more efficiently, much more effectively under a system where we have robust charter schools being expanded and under a system where you do not. And so I'm going to get into just a little bit of quick rebuttal before I get into those points, but I think a lot of the rebuttal that I will have will go into that second point of substantive matter that I have. And so just let's talk about what we heard in the front half just a little bit. So they talked about this idea that teachers' unions will be destroyed if we have charter school systems. And they seem to have this false dichotomy in their heads where they seem to think that public schools are all with teachers' unions and charter schools are all without teachers' unions. And we just think that that's entirely false. We think that there's plenty of public school districts where they don't have teachers' unions, and there are plenty of charter schools where there are teachers' unions. And so what we think is that some people think teachers' unions are good and some people think that teachers' unions are bad. And so when you have more charter schools that allow for these additional choices, both educators and parents and students will choose the schools that they feel are most effectively happening. And so what we feel is going to happen is some charter schools are going to have teachers' unions and some won't have teachers' unions. And so we think that the teachers' union option will still be there for the teachers who feel that that's an effective tool that they need. And so that is not a concern that we have on this side of the house. And so they also, we heard about, towards the second speech, that there's no incentive to teach certain subjects like history, and that history is important for students going out in the real world, but at the same time that these charter schools won't think it's important for them to go out in the real world and teach, so therefore they won't teach it. We think that charter schools will evaluate, as they do, what subjects are important to teach and which subjects are not important to teach, and they're going to teach the ones that they have found very effective to teach, and we think that that is a good thing, and we think that history is going to be included in that, because we think that almost anybody can tell you they have to have a comprehensive understanding of your past, just like First Opposition tells us about what was going on in the past since the Great Depression as to how schools are operated in order to understand what's going on in the future. So we think that that analysis is pretty universal in that we don't have to worry about these schools going history classes going away. And so let's get into the substantive matter about teachers' preferences. And so schools, what happens in a public system is that you have one set of curriculum standards, and teachers have to basically conform themselves to that one standard. And so what we're saying is instead, you're going to have multiple charter schools, which will have multiple curriculums that they aim to teach, and that teachers will then be able to choose which curriculum they feel is best for them to teach at. And so why is that so important? Because two things are going to happen. You don't have to have teachers teaching when they object to the subject matter, when they object to how these things are being taught. And so why would they object to things that are being taught? Or either they feel that the strategies are just not effective, or they feel that they're not qualified to do that. And so if they feel that the strategies are not effective, this is probably because it was picked by the bureaucrats in the political system that we heard about on site government, that they feel is the best way to do that. But instead, teachers are highly educated and highly focused in their field. They spent years studying how to be effective at teaching, whereas politicians have to juggle the education system, also the military system, police, all these other issues. And so we feel that teachers are in a much better position than politicians to figure out which strategies they think are effective and which ones they don't feel are effective. And so we think that they are good at making that. But the other reason that they would object this, as I said, is that they would feel that they are not qualified to teach it. Now this could happen for several reasons. A, they might feel that they're not qualified to teach this because the education that they had was not sufficient when it comes to teaching those particular subjects. We see this in Common Core, which in the state of New York especially was implemented in the middle of the school year, and teachers had absolutely no idea how to teach this new standard of math. And so teachers weren't even given the opportunity to go back and take a summer class to learn about how to teach to this new standard. And so what we're saying is instead, charter schools can sit down with the teachers that they have there and say, oh, this new Common Core standard has come with this math. And so we need to hear from you, when are you ready to implement these standards? And so if you're saying that you need to go to these summer classes to learn more about teaching the standard, that when you are ready, we can make the shift over instead of just having the government mandate when that shift over will happen. And the other reason that teachers might not feel qualified is that some teachers are better at teaching in some ways and some teachers are better at teaching other ways. So we say that teachers will know to look at which schools specifically they would be, that match the things that they would be good at teaching. And so I'll take a POI in about 15 seconds. And so what happens is teachers are then going to find the schools where they are most qualified to teach in the way that that school wants them to teach. And so that means they're going to be much more effective at teaching. And when teachers are much more effective at teaching, then students do much better in the classroom. And when students are doing much better in the classroom, I'll take front half.
Yeah. So would you rather determine what your child is learning? People who are elected and from the local community to be on the school board, or random wealthy people who are chosen to be investors who invest in this charter school?
So what we're saying is, first of all, the investments are coming from the government. And second of all, what we're saying is that teachers are going to choose where they want to teach. So what we're saying is highly qualified teachers are the ones that are going to be making these decisions. And so that's the analysis that I gave you in my speech. And so as I was saying, when teachers are teaching much more effectively, the classroom is going to be a much more focused place. The classroom is going to be some place where students are a lot more engaged, and therefore that's going to solve all the other issues of students not being engaged because of poverty and all those issues that happen in the system. So let's talk briefly about curriculum development and implementation of resources. And so what they were saying on-site government, that we should rely on the politicians and the bureaucracy to come up with these things. However, we think that diseconomies of scale happen. They talked about how it's inefficient economically to have these huge, to have charter schools. But then they also said that charter schools will be used to save money, which seems absolutely bizarre to me to draw that comparison. So what we're saying instead is diseconomies of scale is how you should evaluate this. When schools become so large and they need so much bureaucracy just to run one school, then they can no longer get things done. And instead, curriculums can be developed on a smaller scale and implemented on a smaller and cheaper scale. And that's what we're bringing you on-site opposition.
My thanks to the member of the opposition. We'll now invite the government speaker to close the debate for the proposition.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to sum this round down into two key themes and show you why the round falls to side government, and specifically side-second government. The first theme is pragmatically, how can we offer a better education? How can we get kids the skills they need to succeed in life? And second of all, do public schools matter? Is there this intrinsic value that other schools, non-governmental schools, can't offer? Okay, so let's go to this first idea. The idea of, like, pragmatically, how can we offer the best education? We have, like, two key things from side opposition. The first is, like, funding. Now, they really stake their claim on this idea that, like, more than just government funding, we're going to have these public-private partnerships. Like, these private organizations are going to come in, they're going to give funding, it's going to lead to, like, better incomes for teachers, all of these really good things. Now, we have, like, a few major contentions. First of all, we think that when a private institution enters this marketplace, they're not going to enter to, like, here's money, we don't want anything for it, we don't expect any profit in return, like, we're just going to give the government money. We think, like, that's not how private firms entering public-private partnerships work. Like, when these kind of firms enter government organizations, like building roads, building other types of, like, infrastructure, they expect to get money, they expect, like, a significant return on this investment. So how are they going to do this? We think, like, what this fundamentally will lead to is crony capitalism, where these schools are benefiting from public money while at the same time trying to cut costs to the greatest extent that they can maximize profits. These firms, unlike the state, are not interested in, like, the best outcomes for kids. Maybe some of them are, sure, they're not all these, like, evil institutions. But, like, at the heart of it, these firms are for profit. They care, at least to a great extent, about profit. And so when all of a sudden you're giving at least some of the educational outcomes to these firms as they will demand, like, they're not going to go and say, like, we have no control over this investment. We think what they're going to do is to try to enhance their profitability, as, like, the entire structure of that firm is. They're going to try to cut costs where they see, like, it isn't fit. They're going to try to maximize, like, revenues where they see it is fit. So we think, like through this funding, because of the funding that side government or side opposition is saying they want, we're going to have a lot of, like, bad incentives from other actors in our public school system, which we think would lead to pragmatically worse education. Now, secondly, this came up now from side second opposition. This idea of, like, less regulation. You know, we're gonna have, like, teachers controlling the curriculum, and, like, all these great things. Like, again, though, like, in these kind of public-private partnerships, the teachers don't determine what is taught. Firms determine what is taught, or the government determines what is taught. Like, in the status quo, if you have a public-private partnership where the government determines, like, still, like, what is taught, we think, like, that's the same as the status quo. Like, teachers have no more input, no more flexibility than they do otherwise. Like, however, like, we also could see maybe, like, private firms will now have more input. We think, like, teachers still aren't being the people who have the input. It's these firms instead. Teachers are the employees. They're not the owners of these kind of charter schools. That's not how charter schools work. So we don't think that's going to make sense. We don't think that's actually going to lead to more flexibility. It's actually going to be really bad. Now, that's where we're from side opposition. That's why, like, it's actually going to harm these educational outcomes. Now, what have we told you? Now, like, my partner really brought this up in the second hour. Sure, I'll take it right now.
So, with the vast majority of students in public schools failing things like reading tests and writing tests, why is it important to teach something like music or history when we can actually use that money to teach reading and writing testing when people are incentivized to learn?
Yeah. So that's actually really, I'm flagging that right now. I'm going to go into that. That's my entire second theme, about, like, why these things will actually hurt under the kind of system that they envision, as like he just said. But so I'll flag that when I get back to it. Second, like, what have we told you, like, pragmatically, how, like, this resolution will help education? My partner brought this up in the second part of our extension. This is the idea of this harms the ability to improve education in the public system. Now, like, the charter school movement, they kind of brought this idea that, like, we're going to have, like, all charter schools. The charter school movement is not in the business currently of saying we want to eliminate public schools. Like, that's not what they're saying. Even if it was what they're saying, they can't achieve that kind of like dramatic displacement in education in the United States like over a short period of time. This would take an enormous period of time. So what does that mean? It means that under the model, under this charter school model, there are still going to be kids in public schools. There are still going to be kids in these public systems. What happens though when we say, hey, we have success stories? Like we have this example, like these charter schools are doing really well. The attention of the media, the attention of everyone shifts towards those charter schools and away from public schools, where people are still involved in them, who are generally like more low income because of things like transportation costs, and who are now not getting the resources they need, not getting the attention they need, because it's shifted to other activities. I think this makes it much worse. The charter school system makes educational opportunities now comes much worse. Let's go to the second theme now, about is there an intrinsic value of public schools? Do public schools matter? And now, in the POI that he just gave, like he really summed it up well. He said, like, if we're going like bang for the buck, like people are deciding exactly what they want. He said they're not going to choose things like history and civics. Now, why aren't they going to choose it? Because it doesn't have a direct correlation to like the skills they'll use in the workforce to make money in the long run. And it's like that's what they're saying. They're saying like we don't want government saying like politicizing it, saying teach these things even if you don't see an inherent benefit. And so instead they're saying like kids and teachers and everyone should teach what they want to learn. But what is the result? That these ideas, like things that we want taught, and going to the extension, like we think like our intrinsic values of public education will not be taught because there isn't this inherent benefit like to getting better skills, getting better incomes in the long run. You know, when we're learning the history of the 13 colonies, is that necessarily going to like give you a skill that really helps you get a job? Like, probably not. If you're learning about the political system, unless you're becoming a politician, will that like help you actually make money in the long run? Probably not. And so in a system where it's all up to the actual, like the person being educated themselves, where it's all up to the firm like providing that education, those things won't be taught. Because like the bang for the buck isn't there. Instead, the government forces this in their curriculum intentionally because they know if they didn't force it in the curriculum, it wouldn't be there. And so we think that all these great skills you need to be a good citizen in society, that the government in society realizes you need in society, will no longer be taught, or will be taught to a lesser extent. We think this is incredibly harmful to like having education as a part of democracy. We think that public schools are more than simply like training you to get a job. We think that in a Western liberal democracy, public school is about creating model citizens. They're about creating citizens who can interact in a democracy and in a society in an effective and like positive way. And without public school curriculum actually like being forced to talk about these things will not be discussed. They won't be taught to the same extent. We think that that's a really bad thing. And finally, it's the idea of equality of opportunity again. We think that the government has equality of opportunity. We think the government does have this responsibility to provide everyone the same education equally. We don't live in an equal society, but if we can make some parts of society ever more equal, that's something we stand on inside government. And for those reasons, very proud to propose. Thank you.
My thanks to the proposition for the speaker, and now I'd like to turn the floor to the opposition for the speaker to close the case for those opposed.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I believe also that this debate boils down to two very distinct points, but mine are a little bit different, I believe. My first one is how will charter schools affect the education system? That was a huge topic discussed here. One of the things to talk about is that people said that charter schools were smaller and that's going to make things better. I do believe that having smaller schools will be better for the students and for the teachers because they'll be more individualized in the classroom to help meet those students' needs. Also, if you think about charter schools, they can have different topics to be studied in each charter school. You can have one charter school for the arts. You can have one charter school for math and sciences. This makes that kids who want to study math and science, who want to study the arts, they can study what they want to study to better help themselves as they grow to be adults. We think that is very important on the opposition side. The other thing I want to talk about is the curriculum development that my teammate brought up. You'll have better resources to develop a curriculum that is much smaller. Because if you have a more specialized charter school, you will have more resources to be able to develop that curriculum to fit those students' needs. Cheryl.
So what do you think, like, can you give us a word as to why a company would think they would make more money on an art school versus like a math and science school?
I think that question, that ideal, is very one-sided, and it kind of downs the kids who are into arts, because arts are still a very important thing for jobs and cultures. It doesn't mean they're less than math and sciences, so I do think private institutions will want to have an art school, because there are many people who are very involved in the arts and want to make a life out of that, and they have the opportunity to have schooling focus on their ideas and what they want to do with their life. What my teammate brought up was having multiple charter schools. We think this would be very beneficial because if you take not all the money, take some of the money and give it more charter schools, we can build up more charter schools, which would give kids more opportunities to fit into these charter schools. If we have more, then we will have better education systems across the country, because there will be better schooling systems, more wide range. That brings my point with the opening government brought up, with the lottery system, and it's unfair to those kids who don't get into them. Well, if we expand the charter schools and make more charter schools, then that increases their ability to get into these great schools to have a great education. We think that it's ridiculous to say that you shouldn't make charter schools, make a better education for kids who want it and deserve it. Now, the next point I mentioned was how will charter schools affect teachers. This was a very big point on the back half of the opposition. I really want to hold on to it right now. The government side says that charter schools will demolish teachers' unions. We don't think this is true, first off, because public schools will still exist for those kids who want to be public schools, so that those teachers' unions will still exist. For those, if a teacher wants to have teachers' union, they want to have benefits, they can still choose to be a teacher in a public school system and be a part of a teacher's union. Another part with the, for the teachers themselves working at charter schools, they can have better salaries. And they can also choose which school they want to teach at, so that they can be more qualified in the subject that they're teaching. Now I want to bring up an example that wasn't brought up yet about the Common Core. With that, teachers in public schools, they're being expected to teach the Common Core across the nation. Maybe that one teacher isn't really qualified to teach one certain part of that Common Core, which negatively affects the children in their class and negatively affects their education as a whole. So we believe that teachers can teach to their ability in schools that they are fit and qualified to be in, which would be charter schools, that the teaching will be better overall, giving the students a better education and improving school systems overall. The next point I want to talk about with that is that I'll take the question.
Yeah. What system do you think is going to maximize teacher flexibility? One where they are assured they cannot be fired unless they commit criminal acts, or one where they can be fired literally at any moment for pissing off their boss?
I don't think charter schools will fire teachers at any moment if they piss off their boss. I believe that charter schools will actually be better teachers, more qualified, and happier to be there, so there won't be as many problems in the schools, because they'll be happier to be there to teach what they want to teach. Brings me to my next point. If teachers want to teach a certain subject and have a really passion about this subject, they will be better teachers, and that will give the students a better teacher to learn all these things. And studies have shown that students learn better in an environment where the teacher is so passionate about their topic that they know a wide range about it. They're not bored. They do better on tests. And overall, their education is much better. So basically, why I believe that opposition won this debate is because when government asked how will it affect education, if it's going to demolish it, no, it's going to make the education system better, because it's going to give students better opportunities for a better education. It's going to give teachers better opportunities to teach what they want to teach in environments that they want to teach in, and it's going to and benefit everybody overall in the short run, in the long run. Yes, in the short run, it might be a little bit hard to build up all these charter schools for economic reasons, but in the long run, we believe that having more charter schools and less public schools will be beneficial because students can learn to their own abilities and teachers can teach what they want to teach. And those are all the reasons why we are so proud to oppose.
Thanks to the speakers, to all the debaters. If you want to cross the floor, you're welcome to. Once you've done so, please excuse yourselves to the hall. We'll invite you back in once we have something to announce. Okay, want to take a look over your notes? Let me know.